European cinema was extremely in vogue in the 1960s, so it's not surprising that by the decade's end, Broadway was looking to those films for inspiration and source material. But Hal Prince wanted his musical version of the 1940s novel Zorba the Greek not to be reminiscent of the wildly successful Oscar-winning film adaptation from just 4 years earlier. That would prove to be a tall, counterproductive order. If this is your first time watching one of my videos, hello and welcome. I'm Tim, a New York-based theater critic, and I've been listening to the original Broadway cast recording for every Kander and Ebb collaboration, one by one, and adding them to my ranked list. Zorba is their fourth musical and the second one to premiere in the year 1968. Only 3.5 years after their first. The speed at which Broadway musicals came together in this era was so much faster than it is today. It's also the fourth musical in a row that Kander Ebb were hired to do the songs for, as opposed to the idea for the show originating with them. I wonder where we're going to reach the point where their reputation was established enough that they got to be the driving creative force behind a project. Zorba is the story of a stuffy young man, Nico, who inherits a mine on the island of Crete and travels there to check it out, meeting along the way the older, colorful Zorba, who lives life to the fullest. He's essentially a grifter, but Zorba befriends Nico and they decide to go in on the mining business together. Zorba has a romance with the French innkeeper, Madame Hortense, and Nico with a widow who is also the town pariah. Eventually, after Nico and the widow have sex, the young man who was infatuated with the widow sees them and then dies of suicide. The villagers blame the widow for this and they murder her. Madame Hortense eventually dies of illness and the mine goes bust. At the end of the show, the two men, having lost their business and their women, prepare to part, but not before they dance, Nico having learned Zorba's life lesson. We talked about what a concept musical is in my Cabaret video, and there's a concept here. It's a light one, but it's definitely here. The musical begins in a modern day, meaning 1960s, Greek cafe where the people there are telling stories and they decide to tell the Zorba story, which at that point was a quote old story, and in doing so they transport the show back to the 1920s. These people are quasi-narrators, occasionally commenting on the story, a Greek chorus, if you will. Get it? A Greek chorus for a show set in Greece? Hal Prince seemed to think you'd find this clever. Do you? Never mind that part of the original intention of the novel and film was to give the wider world an example of a more modern Greece that wasn't all about the ancients. But at least they tried to retell the story in the form of a musical, so points for that. Oh, and the leader of this chorus is a character, well, I hesitate to call her a character, but a figure called the leader. She's the MC from Cabaret or leading player from Pippin. Did this show need such a figure? Debatable, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Hal Prince was the director. Joseph Stein wrote the book. Like Cabaret, Boris Aronson designed the sets and won another Tony for them. Herschel Bernardi starred as Zorba, with Maria Karnalova as Madame Hortense, John Cunningham as Nico, Carmen Alvarez as the widow, and Lorraine Serbian as the leader. Zorba premiered at the Imperial Theater in November 1968, and it ran for 305 performances and 12 previews. Despite largely positive reviews and 8 Tony nominations, that run must have seemed like a disappointment for a show that was seen as a follow-up to two of the biggest hits of the 1960s, Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret. Prince produced both of those shows and directed Cabaret, and Zorba appeared to some as an amalgam of the two. Take the book writer, 2 stars, and the general ethnic vibe of Fiddler and add in Cabaret's composers and Cunningham, who was a replacement Cliff. Aronson and costume designer Patricia Ziprod both worked on all 3 shows. Since those 2 shows were gigantic hits, it must have seemed like a winning formula, right? Right? Zorba is one of 3 Kander Ebb shows that had a Broadway revival that ran longer than the original production. The 1983 Broadway production saw Anthony Quinn and Lila Kudrova both reprising their roles from the movie version and was directed by that film's director, Michael Kakianis. The production had a revised script and score, and its tone was considerably brighter than the original. As always, I do not consider revivals when I make my rankings, so I didn't listen to that album. But I do think it's noteworthy that Prince really wanted to differentiate the musical from the film and emphasize the darkness, and yet the legacy of the musical ended up getting subsumed by the legacy of the film. There is a discrepancy between the Zorba of the popular imagination and the actual text. The lasting impression seems to be Zorba's life-affirming philosophy, but the film, at least, complicates that message by the end of it. Yes, it's treated like a lesson that Zorba must impart to his friend, but the famous final image of the 2 dancing on the beach is actually pretty haunting. After everything that's happened, it's clear that the philosophy is little more than a coping mechanism for living in a dark, dark world. I don't know if I have a lot to say about this show, other than to say it didn't really grab me. A lot of people out there who don't like the show have a problem with the material, perhaps the bleakness of it. That's not my issue. I actually like the movie a lot. I watched it years ago. It's the score that I'm not wild about. Clive Barnes said in his review in the Times, quote, "The music by Mr. Kander and the lyrics by Mr. Ebb have much of the deft facility that characterized their work on Cabaret and The Happy Time, but here the ethnic Greek element to the music and the cheerfully philosophical note struck by the lyrics, often Mr. Ebb is both witty and true, endowed Zorba with much more fire and spirit. This is far more stylish than the other 2. I don't agree. The bouzouki stuff is interesting, certainly, but it really only gets to shine in the parts that are instrumental. When the vocal parts come in, I often find it grating, especially the leader's songs. Lorraine Serbian's voice is strong and striking, that's not the issue. It's more that when and why the leader is singing is confusing, and it happens a lot. The leader's role doesn't actually make the story more clear at all. The exception is Life Is, the opening number, which is the most interesting and complex one. So let's go ahead and give that song of the show right now. It's really the only song in the score where the ideas take center stage in an entertaining package. The rest of the score either entertains or does the dirty work of establishing the themes.
Life is what you do while you're waiting to die. Life is all the time goes by.
In trying to duplicate the success of Cabaret, the creators have duplicated some of the problems with that show too. I spent several minutes in my video on Cabaret discussing how underdeveloped Cliff was as a protagonist and how that left a huge hole in the middle of the show. And here they've made deliberate choices to model Nico more closely on Cliff, right down to casting a Cliff. He barely sings, and he doesn't have an established musical identity to contrast him with Zorba. This is a musical. The protagonist should be heavily involved in the musical aspect of the show, shouldn't he? Instead, the musical weight is shifted to Madame Hortense. Just like Fraulein Schneider gets some of the best material in Cabaret, Hortense is given multiple elaborate numbers. No Boom Boom and Happy Birthday are pretty good standard Kander Ebb fare. Only Love is a beautiful song. And while there is certainly nothing wrong with giving great parts to older actresses playing supporting characters, to do so at the expense of developing the main characters suggests to me that Kander Ebb struggle writing for male protagonists. They excel at writing parts for divas. Of course, I liked The Happy Time, which had a male protagonist, quite a bit, so maybe that's the exception, but that show didn't become iconic like their diva-led shows did. Speaking of The Happy Time, in my video I talked about how David Wayne's charismatic performance carried through onto the album. Both Zorba and Hortense get would-be showstoppers in this show, but if they actually did stop the show, it doesn't come through on the album. I think the performers just aren't as charismatic, and there's a serious lack of energy to the performances on this album. It's a big problem for me. Time to rank it. This is my first really tough decision. Do I favor the ambition of a piece like Zorba over execution? I don't think it really works. It's a misfire. But on the other hand, Flora didn't really work for me either, and what it was trying to do was so much less interesting. At least Zorba is taking a swing, so I have to reward that. If I had the two albums laid out in front of me, which one would I reach for first? It's a really tough call. Flora had some pretty good songs, one really good song, and I don't think anything in Zorba reaches the height of A Quiet Thing. Zorba was bringing to Broadway a sound that wasn't expected, and even though it's not my personal favorite, I have to acknowledge that they tried something. They tried something. Join us next week for a show I don't know much about other than it has a interesting title, 70 Girls 70.